Hi, thank you for joining us for the Public Narrative Podcast with Jhmira Alexander. I'm your host, Jhmira Alexander, and I am joined here with the incomparable Helen Shiller. Welcome, Helen. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good, good, good. So, share with us, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so that's where do you want to start?
Yes.
All right, so I've lived in Chicago for 50 years, and came here to organize. And I came here actually in 1972. I had been in Racine, Wisconsin, where I had been organizing. I was an alderman for 24 years in the city of Chicago, and before that, I spent a decade organizing in Uptown, but also in coalitions citywide around issues of survival affordability.
Wow. So, how did you get into that work?
I really, when I went to college in the 60s, I was involved in the anti-war movement, and then ended up going to Racine, Wisconsin, to basically put my mouth where my rhetoric was and to organize. I was concerned. I've been always concerned about racism, and felt that it was my responsibility to organize white people ultimately, and very specifically by the time I came to Chicago, to join the Black-led struggle for liberation. I was recruited to come to Chicago to join a group that was just forming called the Intercommunal Survival Committee, which was white people working under the direction of the Black Panther Party in the white community. So we started right away focusing on Uptown, because Uptown had the largest concentration of poor white people in the city. It also was a very diverse population, largely poor and working families or households. There were people there was largest concentration in an urban area of people, native peoples, who were no longer in their reservations, and had the oldest black community outside of the Black Belt in the city of Chicago, had a large number of the HUD mortgage buildings that had been built in the high rises that were built in the late 60s, early 70s, and people literally from every single continent in the world lived there. So it was extremely diverse. It was a port of entry for Japanese families, had been a port of entry for Japanese families who had come from Arizona and California after World War II, where they had been interned. And later on in the mid-70s for people coming from Southeast Asia. So it was extremely diverse. And almost to a person, the people who were there had already been displaced at least once, if not multiple times. And what was really clear was that this was a community that needed a lot of resources, but if we were going to fight for the resources, we also had to fight to be able to stay there, to be able to enjoy them. And so displacement and fighting against displacement became a very big issue, which was something that a lot of people could embrace because they had been displaced from so many other places before.
Wow, that's incredible. So who has been like one of the greatest influences or influencers of your life?
Well, I suppose, I wrote this book, and I start with the first chapter really is the story of my father sitting me down in front of the family TV during the Army McCarthy hearings in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee of the Senate. And I was 5, I think, and this was the early 50s, and he said, I know that you're wondering why you're here. You're not going to really remember what this is about, but hopefully that it's so unusual, you will. And that what you'll take away from it is that I'm showing you an example of fascism and the resistance to it, and I want you to know that's something you always have to fight.
Wow.
So that was kind of my lodestone, I guess, if you will, early on.
Sure.
Later on, when I read the first chapter book I read was a book by Howard Fast that was on my parents' shelf. It was literally one of many, many books. Only one of many books that survived. My mother getting rid of all of her books in the 50s as a result of a Red Scare, when my father had a brief visit by the FBI. So that's all, and the story behind that's also in the book. But the Howard Fast book was called Freedom Road, and it was a book about Reconstruction. And he writes really he writes so simply. It was so clear, and I was young, but it was literally the first chapter book. But the story and the history of how Reconstruction was completely disrupted and turned on its head, and resulting in Jim Crow and a century of Jim Crow, or more, that really stuck with me. Really stuck with me.
It's evident, and how often do you see that showing up in the work that you do?
I don't know. I just, for me, it's the core for me of what I move forward. My parents were both immigrants, and they came here in 1920, not together. My mother was 6 and a half. She came with her family. My father, and she came from what is now Belarus. Then it was Poland when she came, but it had been Germany when her younger sister was born, and it was Russian when she was born. They all had different birth certificates. My father came here from Latvia, and he was 12. Had to pretend he was 16. He came alone, and he was not in touch with his family most of the time. After that, it was hard to communicate, and there's a sort of a painful backstory to all of that. But he knew that his family had all been, or he was sure his family had all been killed in the Holocaust. So that became, as it turned out, one of his sisters survived, but we didn't know that for many years. So our family dinners, and we had dinner every night at 6. Our family dinners really involved a lot of conversation about the Holocaust as well. We also, when I was born, we lived in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn was, and we lived in Brooklyn just not far away from Ebbets Field, which was the home of the Dodgers, and they were absolutely I had 3 brothers. 2 of them were alive at the time, and my father, and that was like our team, right? And they were all into baseball. So Jackie Robinson had joined the Dodgers just before the same year that I was born. I was born at the end of the year, and that was really a big deal. And so it was the Dodgers versus the Yankees, right? We were there, and all in New York, and their hearts were everyone's hearts. Our hearts were broken when the Dodgers left to come to California. But that was a big piece, and a big piece of it really was that Jackie Robinson, that they'd broken the color line by bringing out Jackie Robinson. So there were all these different elements that were very much a part of the everyday conversation in our family.
So desegregation has been like a part of your life, all of your life, in theory, in rhetoric, in understanding, but then later in application when you joined Harold Washington's campaign.
So a big piece of it was really a notion of self-determination, that communities really had a right to define their reality for themselves both. And then when I became involved with, then after I left college, and one of the things that we always did when we were organizing was sell the Black Panther paper, both in Racine and in Chicago. And the Black Panther paper not only always had the 10-point platform and program, which really spoke to the day-to-day survival needs that people had across the board, not just in the Black community, but also always had international news, always. And when I was in college, I also, in 1968, was part of a group of white students who went to Cuba, and we were there for about 6 weeks. So what I got from all of that was a lot of information and knowledge about what was going on in other countries. In the 60s, there were massive numbers of liberation movements that were successfully transforming the face of the countries in Africa and in Latin America. So that was really, for me, a very important example of the kinds of things that were necessary in order to really create the potential for people across the board in all of our communities to really realize their fullest potential.
No, that's excellent. I'm so fascinated by your life's experience and how you've taken that and applied it to just the community well-being. Like, did you, as you were learning of these things and having these various experiences, world experiences even, did you think that it would come to this in a career in politics and public service?
Oh no, not politics. I hated politics.
Okay.
So I didn't want to, but politics, it became increasingly clear that to do anything, that you had to have a you had to have a long-term perspective. Two, you had to be engaging people collectively in things that actually had a material impact on their lives that were important, and challenge the way things were, because in order to do that, you really had to have policies changed. And if you were going to do that, it was when we were in Racine, it was pretty clear that we should at least be open to, on a local level, when people were running. We did work on a aldermanic campaign in the community where we lived at one point just before I left. But I wasn't really wedded to any of that until I got to Chicago. Chicago, I start canvassing. We're canvassing. We're canvassing just to get to know people. We are canvassing to put together or increase our home distribution route for the Black Panther paper. We're doing it to figure out what programs we want to do that make sense, that are sort of fit into our concept of survival pending revolution. Because in the early 70s, we really thought that was going to happen soon. So that all changed when I came to Chicago, because when we started to go door to door, which we were doing for home distribution routes, for talking to people about the needs that we really were trying to figure out what was going on in the neighborhood, and understanding what was happening, what we needed to do. I was canvassing, and the housing conditions were just terrific. And people had nothing. I mean, it was, there was nothing in anyone's refrigerator. There were roaches and rats running around everywhere, sometimes mice, or vice versa. And so I started talking to people about, maybe we should do something about some tenants' rights, or shouldn't we organize around the landlord, or whatever. I'd come back the next week and we had great conversations. I'd come back the next week and no one would open the door to me. And I figured out that the precinct captain was following me everywhere I went. So then I had to figure out how to open the door, which we did. I wasn't the only one having that experience. And it became apparent that you're in Chicago, you cannot ignore the political structure in Chicago. But the more that we became familiar with the machine, the old alien machine, which was very strong then, the more it became apparent that they had really figured out something that was very effective in terms of a structure. Our problem was what they put into that structure, the content of that structure, and it was very manipulative, and did a disservice to people, because it really didn't acknowledge them. It made them invisible, but it used their vote. It used their who they were. It was very reminiscent of a lot of ways in which racism really actually operates in the country. So, and had, as well as, how people were treated who were intended to be invisible. That was true in Uptown for ex-coal miners. It was true for people who had no resources. It was true for the native population that was there, as clearly had been true for the Japanese Americans who were now there, and clearly, obviously, also true for what was then a growing Black community. So we really couldn't. We had to acknowledge the importance of elections, and we realized that the actual structure that the machine used would be helpful. We just had to find a way to put in a much more progressive and positive content. And that led us to be engaged in various different political campaigns, but also issues that came up in front of the...
But it sounds like the priority was community voice.
Yes.
And experience.
Yes, and community action. And power, in the power as defined. The best definition of power that was always very helpful to me was the way Huey Newton defined it, which was power is the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. I found that really helpful on every level, because you can't, sometimes you know what your goal is. You don't yet know how to get there. You're taking one step at a time, or trying to remind yourself you're taking one step at a time to get there. But ultimately, what are the barriers along the way that you have to deal with, and why do you have to deal with them? And so that notion of power is really important, because you have to engage power, but you also have to understand what it is. And if you understand it from that perspective, it's something you can use personally as well as collectively, because it allows you to be able to see if you're going down a path that is getting at you where you want to go, or if you've hit a roadblock, but gives you the ability to be able to kind of swerve around, because it's the ability to define phenomena and make it act in a desired manner. You want this to be functioning differently. What do you do? What kind of collective action does that take? What do people have to understand? What do you have to understand in order to get there? How do we put all that together? and what does it take to do it? And there's so many elements to that, but it is really a process of us really hearing all the voices, hearing the needs, hearing our own needs, and being able to say, what does it take to actually get that done? So it's a very problem-solving orientation, and I think is really critical, especially today, because we've gotten so much into a polarized situation on the one hand, that it's really hard to get to the depth of something and to really figure out what the solution is. I think that was interesting. We were talking earlier about being frustrated by people are sort of backtracking or what have you. I think people are clarifying. And sometimes it's maybe a backtracking, but I think we have to look at the depth of the situation and look at the context of it and understand that. So I think that I think a really good example of that is the whole discussion around the police and the whole discussion around police misconduct and what you do about it, and the discussion about crime, which I like to say should really be a discussion about public safety.
Absolutely.
And that if we're only talking about crime, then we're stuck in a dynamic that says us versus them. So I think you have to really talk about public safety, because violence is a result of not just the interaction between the violent interaction between individuals or the violent interaction between people and the police. It is the inability to be able to see any progress in that just frustrates us, right? But true public safety addresses all the ways in which people are traumatized, and addresses the source. If it's because they have experienced lead poisoning and don't know how to interact, and the other person doesn't know how to understand where they're at, that creates trauma all the way around. If it's if their plumbing is totally a mess and they end up sick with salmonella poisoning or something else that really ends up killing some people or making them have long-term effects of it, or if they don't have access to medical care, like what happened during the pandemic. I know we have all these people whose lives are completely disrupted, and children who are really facing huge trauma without any response to it. All of those things are as much a cause of of PTSD as any, and then you add to it the focus the media has had, so that even if it's not directly impacting you, it feels like it is, because every day you hear about this on the news, and then you're afraid. So I think that I'm raising this to say that this is not, so people have a lot of responses to it. And one of the responses has been to say we need to reprogram some of the resources that are in the police department to be used by people to do things the police are doing now, but to be done by professionals who are better trained to do it. And that is taking money from one place and putting it to another. And so because some people were saying, what is really the end result of what they want, which is defunding the police. In other words, what they're saying, I think, is we need to change the way things are organized. We need to start looking at this differently. We need to broaden our concept of it, and in the process start shifting things around. Now and in the current situation, we're very ambivalent about interaction between the police and the community, because too often it resolves itself it ends up in a situation that's violent, because we haven't gotten to the point where we're doing what we need to do to avoid that. And instead we keep doing the same thing over and over again, which makes it worse, or just repeats the same behavior. So when someone says defund the police, when someone in a campaign just keeps screaming and yelling they want to defund the police about somebody else, then what they're really saying is we don't want the discussion of all of these things. We don't want to actually make that change. We just want we want to polarize it so nobody will get beyond the surface. And we really have to get beyond the surface, or we're not going to get anywhere. We're just going to stay where we're at, and where we're at is not really tenable. And I think that that's a real problem that we face.
It goes back to your introduction to Chicago and that needs assessment and understanding the needs of the community. A couple years ago, Public Narrative, we worked with the Chicago Police Department and their Youth District Advisory Council. And in that work, we worked with these young people and members of law enforcement to understand some of Chicago's issues, in addition to some of the solutions that might very, very well support community members. But it came with looking at the things that community members were really tormented by, if you will, lack of mental health services, need for jobs, better educational options, mental wellness, like all these different things that impacted end results. And there was something one officer shared that really struck a chord with me. He said he recognized that there are folks that they meet on perhaps the worst days of their lives. And to have that type of awareness, I think the resources being reallocated would allow for other officers to have that measure of awareness going into those types of situations. Like, I know that you can't teach passion and you can't, but I'm clear that there are folks who are simply doing a job and there are those who are passionate about the work. Like, how have you identified and drawn the line for yourself?
Well, let me just go back to what you were saying.
Sure.
Two things. One is that if we were to design our recruitment to the police department based on a real service model as opposed to a military model. Now, there are guns involved, so there's a chain, there's accountability. But if we look at that's required, but if we look at it from a perspective of accountability, a broader perspective of accountability, a little bit different emphasis on it, I think that we would have a different outcome. I remember early on when I was alderman, we had a lot of discussions about the training, not just the training, but the actual the mental health test for people to get into the police department. And there was a lot of pushback from some of the black aldermen, and particularly some of the black aldermen who have been police officers, because they felt that it was that there was too much racial bias in the way that they were approaching it, so that automatically, especially African American, but also Latino applicants to the police department who were being and women were being removed because of the bias that was inherent on the mental health piece of it. It wasn't that, it's just that they didn't fit the mold, but the mold was one that really emphasized a different, wasn't culturally sensitive to the realities of the city.
Absolutely.
But the other thing I wanted to mention is that we did this thing, homelessness was an issue, has always been an issue in Chicago since I've lived here, but it was a particular issue that was important to me to address. People who were unhoused, and we always were in a fight with people who wanted to. We had very good social services around the homeless, and there were all different levels of it, and those services were always under attack because people really felt like if we didn't have the services, then the homeless people wouldn't be here and we wouldn't have to deal with them. There was always that group, and then there was people who wanted to address it. So I asked there was one police commander who really was interested in working on solutions, and we talked all the time. He was curious about what I thought, and I was curious about what he did. So we agreed to do a 24-hour, 3 tours in 24 hours with the mayor's bus, where we invited all of the homeless providers, and we invited all of the people at DCFS that dealt with the homeless providers, the Department of Family Services, which is now Department of Family and Support Services, and the sergeant who was assigned in each of the 3 shifts, and the commander. And what we did was each shift we went and visited each of the homeless provider service programs that were operating during that shift. We go in, we talk to them, they would make sure that people knew we were coming in advance so that we weren't violating anyone's privacy. And then the policymakers from those organizations were on the bus with us, and then collectively we'd have a conversation about potential issues and things we could do about it and voids in service. The commander, when it was all done, said he had an idea, and he decided to ask for 2 volunteers from the police department who would then be available just to work on it as a team dealing with the homeless. And he got 2 volunteers, and they really took to it. And what we learned from that was that over a period of time, they ended up being advocates for the homeless with their colleagues and with their fellow officers. Sometimes, they couldn't get across that people had to be more compassionate. Sometimes they really had a huge impact. The point being that it was a vehicle that allowed people themselves within the police department to have a different experience and have that experience then through them be transformative in terms of how, both for them, but also for their interaction with other officers who
Yeah.
can then learn. Now, it didn't last past the time that this commander was there. You know, they moved around a lot. But I think it was a really good example
Sure.
of an alternative way to approach something. And I think it speaks to the kind of stuff you were just talking
Absolutely.
about. Yeah.
Absolutely. Let me take a step back. I strongly value lived experiences. It became very clear to me in most recent years that as much as I value education, do not get me wrong, like I love to learn, but I recognize the responsibility that we have to become lifelong learners because we don't get all the information in school. And what was apparent to me, I visited the African American Smithsonian in DC. And have you been there yet?
Yeah.
You have?
Yeah.
So
But I only got halfway through, and every time I've gone back, I haven't been able to get in. So I'm going back this summer.
Yeah. So I went a couple, summer of 2019. And as I'm touring the museum, first of all, the curators of that museum, they were very intentional on the type of experience they wanted to convey because it wasn't just taking in the information. It was an experience with history.
Yeah.
And meeting history in a way that I never had. So it challenged me to appreciate stories even more.
Yeah.
Because the book says one thing.
Yeah.
But
People's lives
this
say another.
person,
Yeah.
exactly. And once they open up the pages of their lives,
Yeah.
what more is that going to help to inform? So I really appreciate like the depth and the context that you're providing as we look at like how to go about restructuring society, frankly. Why do you think that folks push back so strongly, around defunding the police or opportunities to just make things more equitable across the board?
Well, I think that there's an element of people being afraid of the unknown or the unsure, and that's encouraged. So we have these dog whistlers, when and I see this happening again and again. When the governor had proposed, when Pritzker proposed the fair tax, and the billionaires came in with all their money to resources to define it as a tax increase. It was only a tax increase to them, and there were a very small percentage of the people who were going to be affected. Everybody else, it would really have been a very positive response and would have created resources to address things that really would allow us to be able to solve core issues and core problems and lead us on a path of that. But people were very confused by the kind of dog whistling, I would call it, that was done during that whole campaign to make people fearful of what they didn't know by painting a picture that was inaccurate, but they did it very smartly because they put it in this context of raising taxes or what have you. I think the same thing has happened clearly with Defund the Police, and it's happening nationally with this I don't know, we're in this divisive situation where the fact that the book burning and the restriction of information has become a political thing that actually is catching on, and that there are states that are refusing to allow things to be taught in schools that are actually factually accurate parts of history is very terrifying to me, because if you don't know your history, it's not just that you'll repeat it, but you don't have the information you need to be able to put all these things in context and not to have this fear. So I think that it is a very worn, but well-worn policy of people who want to keep the status quo to find ways in which to make people fearful of a change in it. And I think that's happening I know that's happening in the aldermanic election in the 46th ward today as we speak, and it's clearly happening citywide in this election. And it's really, it's somewhat shocking to me, but then I've been reminded again and again this last few weeks of a conversation that I had with Harold Washington after the 1987 election. That was when I was also elected, and so we had several conversations, and for the first time, our conversations were as me being an alderman and he being a mayor, but we always ended up having our own little conversation within that. And he told me that I basically said, I saw him one time and he looked really tired and he didn't look like he was feeling very well. And I said, "What's up, Harold?" And he said, "I just feel it hurt. The election hurt my heart." That Verdoliak, who had run on his own party or as an independent candidate in the general election, because then it wasn't a nonpartisan election, in the general election for mayor, Verdoliak got 40% of the vote. And Harold said, "It just hurt me that there were that large number of people that really voted on a basis of race and against me because I was black." Or really that dynamic, it may have not just exactly said that, but that it was a racial vote.
Sure.
And it was. And I think that, and I'm reminded of that, because I think that people fell back in that because of the nature in which some people organize things and make people fearful that they're somehow going to lose something if other people get something.
Yes.
And it's just not the way things are. That if it can be, you can make it that way, but it shouldn't be. In 1991, I was alderman. And this was a few years after Harold had died. And I believe I can't remember, it was when I was just elected or just before the election, but I made a proposal that we implement a city income tax and tie to it, and ask the legislature, who had to approve this, to tie to it a requirement that for every dollar we got from the income tax, we removed from our request from the property tax. Because an income tax is much more progressive. It's based on what people can afford, and also would capture people who came and worked in the city, didn't pay any taxes in the city previously, but whom we spent public dollars on, whether it was on the streets for them to get here, the public transportation, or whatever. And that by doing so, we would lower the property tax, which is based on property value, not on whether you could afford to pay, and replace it with the income tax and broaden the base for the income tax, so you'd be paying less in taxes. And that would, by doing so, not only would we make this shift, but we also would create additional resources, which then identified as a vehicle for us to be able to address recycling. We weren't yet talking about climate change, but we knew that we needed to do some things to be friendly to the earth, and also affordable housing. And Ed Burke, who was alderman at the time, said, told me, "This could never pass." And I said, "Why not?" Now, this is somebody who made his living off of the property tax. He was an alderman and he got paid like the rest of us, but he had a law firm. And his law firm was one of several that did challenges to appeals to the property tax, especially for large corporations. And they made a great deal of money by doing it. So he was, on the one hand, voting to increase people's property taxes, and on the other hand, making sure that large corporations didn't have to pay their fair share. And he said to me, "This will never pass because everyone's going to think that you're just double taxing them, and no one's going to believe that you're taking that away." Now, he knew that it was the law I was asking to change would put the two together, but he was right there, right up front. He knew exactly how he was going to make sure that it never got considered. And I think so he was benefiting by keeping it the way it was, but in the public interest, it really would have been, I think, more beneficial to do the other.
Right.
But because he was in a position, he was of really supporting the status quo and power in supporting it. He was part of that power structure. He was able to define it in a way that made it impossible for us to move forward. And I think that that's pretty common.
The context that you've offered has really helped to put things in perspective about the ways in which we can engage with the issue. So there's engaging with the issue from a solutions-oriented standpoint, and then there's engaging with the issue based on how people understand it, and that understanding then leaning to what their own personal experience will be, not recognizing that perhaps moving policy forward and addressing things in a different manner rather than fighting it will then offer liberation for everyone.
Yeah, I think that it's about what is the truth of the matter in terms of opening up the avenues for coming to new solutions versus the people, versus the inclination for some to want to protect where they're at, and therefore not looking at the truth of the matter so much as just knee-jerk reaction or even intentional reaction.
Sure.
I want to keep it the way it is because it benefits me, and I don't really
Sure.
care if it solves other people's problems.
Sure. So help me understand, like, this is a very intense time in our city, in our state, in our country. How does someone who they may be passionate about like civic service, but have no full comprehension of how to leverage that, like how would you advise someone getting into this work?
Well, I think that I just think people have to do what is natural for them to do, what makes sense in terms of who they are, how they feel about stuff, and what they're comfortable doing. I think the most important thing is that I said this to someone the other day, and they said, "You mean incremental change?" And I don't. So I want to say that up front. I think that change happens, change happens no matter what. The question is, what kind of change you're going to see. And if you have a goal or an objective, I like to think of it as there's a mountain to be moved, and you'd move that shovelful by shovelful. You can't jump into it. You can't push it. It's too big.
Right.
So it's shovelful by shovelful. The more people with more shovels, obviously, the faster the mountain gets moved. So I think you need to be intentional. I think you have to have a long-term perspective. I think you have to have a collective process or engage in one. But I think you have to respect also yourself and your ability that each thing that you do is something. You have to, know that and remind yourself, because we always used to say quantitative change leads to qualitative change. There are moments that happen that if we're lucky enough, we're there and can make a choice to participate. Harold Washington's election for me was one of those, but there's been a lot of them in my lifetime. And I think that that's true for all of us. Sometimes it's negative, sometimes it's positive, but it's a moment. But those moments happen as a result of everyday, constant activity, things people do over and over again and think, oh my God, what am I doing? And then all of a sudden it has an impact because there's been enough discussion, there's been enough airing, there's been enough issues with it, there's been enough knowledge of what's going on that's been shared collectively, that there's been a sea to swim in that has changed the direction. And so I think that if we think of it in terms of the changes we want, we need to create a sea of change, a sea that moves the momentum in that direction, that gives the people who are in positions of power, whether it's in government or outside of government, create the opportunities for accountability, because you have this sea and it's moving and it's pushing people along, or it's involving more people to push more people along, that is the best way we'll see a result. So any way that anyone can contribute to that becomes important and valuable. And any process that anyone can engage in to get more understanding, more knowledge, more conversation with others, more insights into what needs to be done, to be able to use their talents, which we all have. We all have our unique talents in order to further that. So I don't think that there is a special, this is your path or this is what you have to do. I think we all need to find our path. We all need to recognize our plumb lines, who we are, what our core is, contribute to that, grow that, love the development that we see around us, the human development and that of ourselves, and then look for the solutions and look for them and evaluate them from the perspective of a material impact that really does move the situation forward and really help people. People have to survive day to day, and we have to address the issues we have day to day in order to be able to get some real value out of that survival. Some depth to it, some joy and happiness in our lives, and I think that we need to incorporate that into what we do every day. But it's a social collective process.
Yes, absolutely. You opened up a lot of stories during our time together. Like, how can folks learn more about your experience? You just put a book out. How can folks connect and purchase the book?
So the book is called Daring to Struggle, Daring to Win, 5 Decades of Resistance in Chicago's Uptown Community, which actually starts before I got there to make it 5 decades. It's available on any online platform that you can buy a book from, and in most of the local bookstores, especially in Chicago. And you can learn more about it and me. We now have at least a landing page for a website, which is helenshiller.com, and and I've been doing events, and you can find out about them. But the book really does. The book is my slice of the multiple things that I was involved and engaged in from Chicago from 1972 to 2011 when I left City Council. But it also has the first 70 pages before I get to Chicago sort of give my backstory, a lot of which I made reference to.
Sure.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching the Public Narrative Podcast. I'm your host, Jhmira Alexander, joined by the wonderful Helen Shiller, and we'll see you on our next episode.